Trying to be unfaithful to my husband with his own friend was the worst mistake of my life, and I couldn't pay a higher price. My name is Mariana, I'm 33 years old, and just a few months ago, I had what I could describe as the perfect life. I was married to Anderson, a wonderful man I met over a decade ago in college. He was studying civil engineering and I was studying graphic design. We met at one of those college parties that neither of us wanted to go to, but which ended up being the place where our lives changed forever. Anderson was different from any guy I had met before. He had a calmness in his eyes, a confidence that made me feel like everything was okay when he was near. While most of the guys in college seemed more interested in fleeting fun, he talked about his goals, about how he wanted to build a solid future. I fell in love with him not just for who he was at that moment, but for the man I knew he would become. After we graduated, we started dating seriously. Anderson got a job at an engineering firm while I made my way as a freelance designer. At first, our lives were simple but full of dreams. We got married 3 years later in a small cozy ceremony in a country house surrounded by flowers. It was the happiest day of my life. I remember looking at Anderson while we said our vows and thinking, this is the man I want to spend the rest of my life with. And for a while I felt that way. Our relationship was always solid. Anderson is the kind of person who is always there, who never stops supporting, who never stops loving. But me, I'm different. I've always had this need to feel something new, to seek intensity in my life. Anderson gave me stability, but there were times when I wondered if that was enough. After we got married, we moved to a house on the outskirts of the city. It was small but cozy, with a garden where Anderson and I spent afternoons tending our plants. He was passionate about his work, and although his long hours at the office sometimes made me feel lonely, he always found a way to make up for it. Weekends were ours. We cooked together, went for walks in the park, or just stayed home watching movies and talking about everything and nothing. I, for my part, had managed to establish myself as a graphic designer. I had my own studio at home, which allowed me to manage my time and take care of the home. At first, everything seemed perfect. We were a team, two people building a life together, sharing goals and dreams. However, over the years things began to change. Routine set in, and although I still loved Anderson, there was something in me that was starting to feel restless. I couldn't explain it, but there were days when I felt like something was missing, as if a part of me was looking for something I didn't even know what it was. After 7 years of marriage, the spark I once felt with Anderson began to fade. It wasn't his fault. It was something inside me. Anderson was still the attentive and loving man I married. He never made me feel unappreciated or ignored, but sometimes his predictability, his stability felt like a cage. I, on the other hand, had always been more impulsive. I loved to experiment, try new things, explore. While Anderson found happiness in routine, I began to feel suffocated by it. I tried to ignore that feeling, to focus on our marriage, on the good times we still shared. But the restlessness was still there, growing slowly. It was at that moment that Anderson started working on a new project that kept him away from home for long hours. For the first time in years, I spent many nights alone with too much time to think. I tried to fill it with work, with hobbies, even with outings with friends, but nothing seemed enough. I felt an emptiness that I couldn't explain, and that feeling that something was missing only grew stronger. It was in the midst of that loneliness and confusion that Sergio entered our lives. I met Sergio at a dinner party Anderson organized at home. He's a friend I met on the project, he told me enthusiastically as we prepared the table. Anderson didn't usually make new friends easily, so I was glad that someone had managed to connect with him. When Sergio arrived, I understood why. He was the kind of person who lit up a room with his presence, tall with an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance, but in a way that was intriguing rather than annoying. Sergio was an architect, and apparently he and Anderson had made a great team on the project. During dinner, he quickly won me over. He was funny, eloquent, and knew how to keep a conversation interesting. I couldn't deny there was something about him that caught my attention, but at that moment, I didn't think much of it. From that night on, Sergio became a constant presence in our lives. He came to dinner frequently, sometimes bringing bottles of wine that we shared while talking about all sorts of things. Anderson considered him a close friend, someone he could trust, and at first I saw him that way too. But over time things began to change. Sergio wasn't just charming. He knew how to make a person feel special. He paid me compliments that, although always respectful, had a nuance that made me feel nervous. "Anderson is lucky to have you," he would often say with a smile that was hard to read. I always laughed, trying to ignore the warmth those words caused in me. Anderson, of course, suspected nothing. He was completely oblivious to what was happening because at that point I didn't even know exactly what it was. I just knew that Sergio awakened something in me, something I hadn't felt in years, and that both terrified and fascinated me. With each visit from Sergio, that tension in the air became more palpable. I began to notice that our conversations were longer when Anderson wasn't around. If he went out to the garden or retired to work on something, Sergio and I would stay talking, laughing, sharing details of our lives that are not normally shared with a simple friend. There was something in his gaze, in the way he listened to me, that made me feel like I was the only person in the world at that moment. One afternoon, Anderson had to leave early for a meeting, leaving Sergio and me alone at home. It was one of those situations where the silence between two people seems to carry more weight than it should. Sergio asked me how I was, and somehow our conversation turned more personal than it had ever been. I told him about my insecurities, about how I sometimes felt trapped in a routine, and he listened with an attention that disarmed me. "Mariana, you have to be happy. That's what matters," he said. And those words resonated in my head long after he left. Nothing physical happened that day, but it was the beginning of something I couldn't control. Something that deep down I knew would end up destroying everything I had built with Anderson. After that afternoon when Sergio and I shared more than we should, I started to notice changes in myself. It was as if something had been ignited, a spark I didn't know how to put out. Every time I knew Sergio was coming over or that we would see him somewhere, I would get more nervous than usual. I spent hours choosing what to wear, making sure my appearance was impeccable. Although I tried to convince myself that I was doing it for myself, I knew it wasn't true. Sergio, for his part, seemed to enjoy the dynamic. His compliments were increasingly obvious, his glances longer. One night while we were having dinner, all three of us, he made a comment that left me frozen. Anderson was talking about some problem at work and Sergio, looking directly at me, said, "Well, at least you have Mariana. She's an incredible woman. She always knows how to make you feel better, right?" Anderson smiled, taking the comment as an innocent compliment, but I felt the air thicken. Sergio held my gaze as he spoke, and at that moment, I knew he was crossing a dangerous line. The worst part is I didn't do anything to stop him. Instead of setting boundaries, I allowed that game to continue. I felt flattered, desired, and that feeling was addictive. It wasn't long before we started texting. At first, they were casual conversations related to Anderson's projects or innocent jokes, but soon the messages took on a different tone. Sergio would send me things like, "I can't stop thinking about our conversation the other day," or, "You're so incredible that sometimes it's hard not to tell you more often." I should have stopped it there. I should have deleted his number, but I didn't. Instead, I replied not directly, never as explicitly as him, but I didn't do anything to cut that tie that was forming either. Every message from him made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It was like I was playing with fire, knowing I could get burned, but unable to stop myself. One weekend, Anderson organized a barbecue at home and invited Sergio and some other friends. Everything seemed normal, at least on the surface. However, I was constantly aware of Sergio's presence, of how our glances met more often than should be natural. Every time Anderson walked away to tend the grill or get something in the kitchen, Sergio would find an excuse to come closer to me. At one point, while I was alone in the living room serving drinks, Sergio came in behind me. "Everything okay?" he asked with that smile that always made me nervous. I nodded quickly, trying not to look directly at him, but he didn't move. "Mariana, you know this isn't easy for me," he said softly, moving a little closer. I froze, my heart beating so fast I felt like it was going to explode. "What are you talking about, Sergio?" I whispered, even though I already knew the answer. "This is what I feel every time I see you," he confessed, and for a moment I felt the world stop. No one had said anything like that to me in years, and although I knew it was wrong, I couldn't help but feel drawn to his words. Before I could respond, Anderson walked into the room with a tray of meat. "Everything all right here?" he asked, oblivious to what had just happened. Sergio and I exchanged a quick glance and both pretended that nothing had happened, but at that moment, I knew things were about to get out of control. One night, Anderson had to travel for work, leaving the house to me alone. It was the first time in years that I felt completely free, and that feeling terrified me. I tried to distract myself by watching movies, working on a pending design, even reading, but nothing worked. My mind was fixed on Sergio. That same night, I received a message from him. It was simple. "Are you alone?" My heart skipped a beat. I knew that responding to that message would be a mistake, but my impulse was stronger than my reason. "Yes, why?" I wrote back. What followed was a conversation charged with tension. Sergio hinted that he wanted to see me, that he could come over just to talk. Every fiber of my being told me that I shouldn't accept, that this would only end badly. But there was a part of me, a selfish and impulsive part, that wanted to feel that intensity he made me experience. Finally, after a long exchange of messages, I agreed. I told him he could come over, but only for a few minutes. When he arrived, my heart was beating so fast I thought I would faint. I let him in, trying to maintain my composure, but from the moment he crossed the door, everything changed. We sat on the sofa, at first talking about trivial things, but it wasn't long before the conversation took a more personal turn. "Mariana, I can't get you out of my head," he finally said, looking at me with an intensity that disarmed me. "This is wrong, Sergio. We can't do this to Anderson," I murmured. My words sounded weak even to me. But instead of stopping, he moved closer and I didn't move. At that moment, all the weight of guilt disappeared, replaced by a desire I couldn't control. What happened next was quick, almost mechanical. I didn't think about Anderson or what this would mean for my marriage. I only thought about how Sergio made me feel in that instant. But when he left and the house fell silent again, reality hit me like a train. After that night, nothing was ever the same again. I woke up the next day feeling like I was carrying a huge weight on my chest. The house that was once my refuge now seemed like a place full of shadows. Everything in it reminded me of Anderson. The photos of our wedding in the living room, the small details he always took care of, like the vase in the center of the table with fresh flowers he bought every week. Every corner shouted his name, and with it, my betrayal. That morning, when Anderson called to tell me he would be arriving early from his trip, my heart skipped a beat. His voice sounded as always warm and loving, completely oblivious to the disaster I had started. I tried to sound normal, but the words came out haltingly. He didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. When he arrived that night, he greeted me with a kiss on the forehead and a bouquet of flowers. "I missed you," he said with that calm smile that always made me feel safe. At that moment, I wanted to confess everything, tell him what I had done and face the consequences. But the words got stuck in my throat. Instead, I faked a smile and served him dinner, all while guilt consumed me inside. Sergio, for his part, wasn't making things easy. He texted me constantly, asking when we could see each other again. At first, I tried to ignore him, but his insistence made me waver. A part of me knew I had to cut off all contact with him, but another part, one I hated to acknowledge, still desired him. As the days went by, Anderson began to notice that something was wrong. He wasn't the jealous or controlling type, but he had always been perceptive. "Are you okay, Mariana? You seem distracted lately," he asked me one night while we were having dinner. "Yes, I've just had a lot of work," I lied, avoiding his gaze. He didn't insist, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. That same night, while he slept, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering how I had gotten to this point. Anderson didn't deserve this. He was a good man, a great husband, and I was destroying him. I decided I had to end everything related to Sergio. I couldn't keep playing with fire. So the next day, I sent him a message telling him that we couldn't continue seeing each other or talking. His response was quick. "You know this isn't over. See you tomorrow at the office." When I arrived at the office the next day, Sergio was already there waiting for me. His gaze was intense, charged with a mixture of defiance and desire that made me feel trapped. "Mariana, you can't just ignore what happened," he said softly, cornering me in a place where no one could hear us. "It shouldn't have happened, Sergio. It was a mistake and it won't happen again," I replied, trying to sound firm, but my voice was trembling and he noticed. "A mistake? Because for me it wasn't, Mariana. I know you feel the same way I do. This isn't something you can ignore," he said, moving closer. "Think about Anderson," I murmured, desperately trying to find a way to stop this. But Sergio didn't seem to care about my marriage. And did you think about him that night? He replied with a smile that made me hate and desire him at the same time. I knew I had to be strong, put an end to all this, but Sergio had a way of making me feel weak, of manipulating my emotions so that I was convinced that what we were doing wasn't so bad. That was the first time I felt real fear of myself, of my inability to tell him no. Meanwhile at home, things with Anderson began to deteriorate. Although he didn't know exactly what was going on, he could feel that something had changed. His attempts to get closer to me only made me feel more guilty, and that guilt made me pull away even further. I wanted to tell him the truth, tell him everything and ask for forgiveness, but I couldn't. Despite my attempts to get away from Sergio, it wasn't long before I fell back into his web. One afternoon while working on a project at home, I received a message from him. "I'm near your house. Can I stop by?" My first instinct was to say no, but something in me, that weak and selfish part that always wanted more, led me to reply with a simple okay, but only for a little while. When he arrived, my heart was already racing. I let him in, and before I could even say anything, he closed the door behind him and kissed me. It was a kiss I didn't reciprocate at first, but which eventually overcame me. It was only kissing, caressing. There was nothing more. For me, sleeping with Sergio would have been infidelity. Just that afternoon in my own house, I betrayed Anderson in a way I never thought I would be capable of. When Sergio left, the guilt was even more crushing than before. I knew what I was doing was unforgivable, that I was destroying not only my marriage but also the trust of the person who loved me most. Days later, Anderson found something he shouldn't have. A message from Sergio on my phone, one I hadn't deleted. The content was incriminating, impossible to misinterpret. "What is this, Mariana?" he asked, holding the phone in his hand, his face furious. I knew I couldn't keep lying, that this was the moment I would have to face the consequences of my actions. I swallowed and looked him straight in the eyes, although I had trouble holding his gaze. "Let me explain, please," I said, even though I didn't know where to begin. Anderson dropped the phone on the table and crossed his arms, waiting. "So? Tell me what this means." His tone wasn't aggressive, but every word carried a weight that made me feel small. "It's Sergio," I began, my voice trembling. I made a mistake, Anderson, something I should never have done." As I spoke, tears began to stream down my cheeks. I didn't try to stop them. "I was unfaithful to you." Those words felt like a dagger in the air. Anderson closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if trying to process what he had just heard. "How long, Mariana?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Twice," I admitted, although it wasn't the whole truth. I couldn't tell him that it had happened more than once in his own house. I even felt like a monster for having allowed things to go so far. Anderson stood up and began to pace the room. "Why? Why would you do something like that?" he asked without looking at me. His tone wasn't one of anger, but of such a deep sadness that it broke me. "I don't know," I sobbed. I felt confused, trapped, but I never stopped loving you, Anderson. I swear to you. The words sounded empty even to me. I knew that what I had done had no justification. "Confused? That's all you have to tell me?" he asked, finally looking at me. His eyes full of tears he was trying to hold back. "And is he your solution to that confusion?" I shook my head quickly. "He means nothing to me. It was a mistake, and I regret it more than you can imagine." I approached him, trying to take his hand, but he pulled away. "Anderson, please give me another chance. We can fix this." I didn't forgive myself at all. During the following days, the tension in the house was unbearable. Anderson barely spoke to me, and when he did, his words were cold and cutting. He slept on the couch, and every time I tried to talk to him, he ignored me or left the room. One morning, while I was in the kitchen making coffee, Anderson approached me with an envelope in his hand. "Take it," he said, placing it on the table. I knew what it was even before I opened it. "Divorce?" I asked with a lump in my throat. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "This has no solution, Mariana," he finally said. "I can't look at you without thinking about what you did. I tried to understand, I tried to forgive you, but I can't. I can't keep living like this." I burst into tears at that moment, begging him to reconsider. "Please, Anderson, I swear this will never happen again. I'll do whatever it takes. I'll change. I'll seek help. Just give me another chance. He shook his head, his eyes full of sadness, but also of determination.
No, Mariana.
I don't trust you anymore, and without trust, there is no marriage. I tried to argue, but nothing I said had any effect. Anderson was determined. That same week, he began the process of moving out and dividing our assets. After Anderson left, the house felt empty in a way I had never experienced before. Everything reminded me of him. His favorite mug, the notes he used to leave me, even the small gestures I had taken for granted. His absence was a constant reminder of what I had lost, of what I myself had destroyed. Today I look back and I can't help but feel full of regret. I lost a man who loved me unconditionally, someone who would have done anything for me. I lost the stability we had, the life we built together over the years, and all for a moment of selfishness, for an insatiable need to feel something new. I know Anderson will never trust me again, and I understand. If I could go back in time, I would do things differently. But now all I can do is carry this guilt, this emptiness that I myself created.